A common error within the popular discourse of social justice is the identification of the individual with the category. To hold, for instance, that women are such, or men are such and such, or whites are such and so forth. The notion being that there are broad cultural categories of distinction which meaningfully apply to the individuals therein. It may in fact be the case that there are broad categories of distinction which meaningfully apply to individuals. What is far more dubious is that there are broad cultural categories as such that meaningfully apply to individuals. Culture is nebulous, largely imaginative in form, and changing as it interfaces with other cultures. In other words, a cultural category is largely aesthetic in its form, thereby creating distinctions between peoples who are fundamentally largely similar. This grouping and that grouping of, say, Asian women, are different predicated upon the fairly far-flungly ephemeral forms of cultural expression. Such constitutes a meaningful category of distinction, predicated upon the aesthetics of their forms. Such aesthetics amount to, on the one hand, gendered expressions of cultural norms, and on the other hand, subtle biological differences as in phenotype. These distinctions between folks as a matter of category are not well founded to individuals. Such is similar to the classic philosophical discussion regarding forms. There is the aesthetic category of, to continue the example, Asian women, that we refer to in abstraction, but which is not exemplified in any given individual within the category. All Asian women partake in the form, but no Asian women exemplify it. That they are aesthetical in their expression entails a certain kind of ethical considerations, as given in the Odd Questions of Privilege, a slight history of colonialism. Namely, they are expressions that are ethically praise/blameworthy but not ethically obligatory. Their virtues and vices as aesthetics are praise/blameworthy, but not obligatory to enforce, hold to, etc. The aesthetic categories themselves are, therefore, also fairly loosely defined, with clear variations in the form's expression, whereby nonetheless the category has ontological import. In the academics, these distinctions are most regularly made clear. To hold that category X has some notable characteristic is not to hold that all individuals within said category actually embody that trait. Indeed, oft such traits are things which only become manifested within the category itself. The notion of something being cultural or systemic is not something which is necessarily or even possible to be embodied by the folks who constitute that category. There may be self-similar relations to the individuals that comprise such things, and indeed, this piece is holding that it is possible to understand the actions of individuals, familial units, etc., as comprising and creating scalarly larger forms of a cultural expression is exactly the self-similarity relation. The scalarly larger forms in turn have real ontological import, and hence do in point of fact create and shape the realities of the individuals therein. We may point to the various phenomena within the communication sphere, information bubbles, and so forth as expressions of exactly that. More brazenly, we may point to unicorn cultures as manifestations of this kind of phenomena. But for all that, gross categorical error is such a systemic problem within the current gendered analysis that it ought not be ignored. In the worst case, such gross categorical errors constitute the kind of racist, sexist, classist, and bigoted concerns the folks writing about it are concerned with. which, to be clear, is understood in this piece primarily as the mistaking of an aesthetical cultural category as if it were an ethically obligatory kind of category, or the other way round. By and large, and perhaps in total, these kinds of socio-cultural justice problems are various versions of collective action problems, and problems of the commons, each of which have known and defined solutions, many of which amount to head nodding of agreement, some of which also require defined actions following the head nodding of agreement. To wit, the problems of sexism. Let us note therein a rather trite, dull point. When it comes to problems regarding sexism, these problems are definitionally problems between the sexes. To wonder at, say, why sexual violence against men is generally perpetrated by women, is to note the super boring fact that women are primarily interested in sexual interactions with men. Likewise, to note that sexual violence against women is generally perpetrated by men, is to note the super boring fact that men are primarily interested in sexual interactions with women. Beyond sexual violence, in terms of socio-cultural problems, there is every sense in which who we argue with, fight with, and so forth is of course the other sex relative to whatever the reader's sex or sexual interest is. Perhaps that can be made clearer by pointing out that folks within same-sex relationships also fight, hurt each other, and in short, comprise the most significant part of the problems in their lives. See for instance how folks in the queer community in the current are oft fighting amongst themselves. We might wonder, in other words, in regards to sexism, who else you think is gonna be causing those problems? Critically, we may also note, where else you getting your joys? Sexism thereby can largely be understood as a collective action problem in that as each individual experiences bads in their lives relative to the other sex, the temptation to blame the sex creates the problem of sexism. Each individual therein legit experiences these bads in life, and in some sense, of course, it's stemming from the other sex, but that doesn't thereby imply in any sense that there is anything more meaningful to these problems than the trite, dull point noted above. I'd strongly suggest here, indeed admit here openly, that the proper methodology of thinking about these kinds of issues is as they relate to love's relationships. How sexual dynamics functionally operate. If there are problems, and I think there are likely problems, understanding them categorically as stemming from the heteronormative complex with a significant queer component is the first proper delineation to be making, rather than gendered as such. Understanding them as problems with how the species loves is likewise a proper delineation. To be clear there, the issues are about how the species loves, and the proper way of analyzing that is via the conceptual framework of heteronormative complex with a significant queer component. Well, and honestly to also look at it from the perspectives of differentiations between the self-lovers, the per se lovers, and the lovers of others, the per vos lovers. It is only within those conceptual frameworks that the gendered analysis ought be done, for it is only within those conceptual frameworks that a gendered analysis begins to make sense. More pointedly, it is only therein that a gendered analysis can be honest about the realities, rather than merely tossing around gendered blame, and making the categorical errors being described here. In the current discourses, dialoguing, and relevant lit, the collective action problem becomes the problem of applying the bads of the individual to the sex categorization of the perpetrator, or conversely, to applying the sex categorization to the individual as such, itself being a related kind of bad. Such amounts to a gross categorical error in analysis, and one way or another, mistaking an aesthetical ethical concern for an ethically obligatory sort of concern. For sure, there is likely value in noting the mechanisms of behavior whereby such things happen, and there is value in stigmatizing, tabooing, criminalizing, or outlawing kinds of behavior. But note that by and large, these are things we already do, generally always have, and there are serious issues that can arise by doing so, many of which are covered here in a specific manner, and generalized in the odd questions of privilege, a slight history of colonialism. The aim therein being to mitigate the harms associated with sexual interaction. As I am reading the various issues, the difficulties are far more in the realms of prosecuting those sorts of behaviors, rather than nuancing them. Among the most egregious and rather obvious issues, historically, and in the current, is the criminalization specifically of men's sexual behavior. Be it violence, or rape, or sexual infraction, or abuse, the criminalization of men's behavior has become such a broadly held cultural norm that folks have a difficult time even understanding that women's behavior is, statistically speaking, just as shitty. It is merely that women's shitty behavior isn't generally criminalized, whereas men's shitty behavior generally is. Mean Girls, the movie, The Notion, etc., are real shitty behavior. Common kinds of shitty behavior, specifically, shitty behavior that is generally associated with women. Gossip, social manipulation, emotional manipulation, unrestrained violence, etc. These kinds of things are understood as bads, but are not actually criminalized. At most, they are stigmatized. Oft, however, they are not even given that degree of problematization. There are some exceptions, and perhaps they are worth pointing out. Prostitution is generally a women's kind of shitty behavior, and it has been generally criminalized. However, of course, note that in the current discourses this kind of shitty behavior is oft viewed as if the women doing it were the victims. Meanwhile, the decriminalization of this sort of behavior is rampant, such that various versions of sex work are normalized. The point, here at any rate, isn't to necessarily say that, therefore, sex workers ought to be criminalized. The point here is to note the degree whereby men's behavior is criminalized. Women's behavior is generally not, even in instances whereby more or less the exact same thing is being done. This constitutes a kind of collective action problem, whereby gross categorizations of peoples are mistaken as being the perpetrators of a bad. For each individual suffering from a bad, there is a temptation and a good in terms of feelings to blame the sex as a whole. But when everyone does this, the good of the feeling actually turns to a bad of the feeling and a bad as a whole. Such amounts to a kind of bad faith head nodding of agreement towards the ends of criminalizing certain kinds of behavior. Something that is remedied via similar head nodding of agreement. The criminalization of men's behavior is covered later in this piece and series. See especially the sections Iterative Gendered Sexual Violence and Criminalization, Culturalization. What is far more noteworthy here is the degree to which the transitory states of sexual interaction are little more than broad head nodding of agreement between the parties involved. Sexual harassment is a great example. Sexual harassment amounts to unwanted sexual attention in some form or another, traditionally in regards to the workplace, though its common usage has expanded towards virtually any setting. That movement of setting itself ought be sufficient for folks to really grasp at the scope of the problem. What was, perhaps legitimately, a concern for the workplace, whereby workplace power structures might be used to sexually use and abuse people, is now taken to arenas whereby there is actually no expressed legal power structure. What was a well-defined and confined kind of concern has become a concern as if it were applicable in any and all circumstances. To give unwanted sexual attention to someone in a workplace setting amounts to harassment, not exactly or just because it is unwanted, but rather because it is done in a context whereby the power distribution may entail that the sexual attention can amount to abusive sorts of control and manipulation. The exact same actions, including being unwanted, when done in a setting whereby there ain't these kinds of expressed power structures in place, does not carry the same sorts of abusive connotations whatsoever. This point will be expanded upon a great deal in this piece and in this series. The thing is, what amounts to unwanted is little more than a cultural agreement between the parties involved. What is acceptable sexual attention has varied greatly over time. Catcalling, for instance, was a cultural norm, and was largely agreed to by men and women as acceptable behavior. We may ponder at why, but we needn't think too hard about it, TBH. Women and men both like sex. They like to meet, and ultimately pre-modern communications especially, the idea of going out oft entailed exactly the notion of going out to find a mate, a lover, etc. Everyone knew it, and everyone accepted it. If folks listen to the women of the era, that is, if they take the time to look it up, listen to original source material, etc., women actively dressed up and went out for exactly those purposes. Not all the time, not in every context, and so forth, for sure. The point is simply that it was a cultural practice whereby folks by and large understood that catcalling was an accepted, not horrible norm. Understand that these kinds of behaviors were still prevalent in my youth, in the 80s and 90s. That even in the 90s I, and more broadly my little cadre of high-flying young intellectuals, were talking about this stuff then. To the point therein, I, and we, spoke with women, and we to some extent were women, and of the women this is exactly what they said that they wanted, did and enjoyed. It was a cultural norm even then, as even then, we were pre-internet age more or less, and of course the women wanted to get laid, y'all. And of course the men wanted to get laid. And of course they dressed up and went out and tried to meet people literally on the street. Likewise, going to the local meat market, the club, the bar, whatever it may be, was an understood place to meet a potential lover. Folks dressed up for it, went out for it, and so on. Why? Because women and men like sex, and not really much more to it than that, TBH. Once there is broad cultural agreement as to what the norms are, sexual attention takes that form. It becomes wanted in the sense that an agreement has been reached whereby folks understand the terms of interaction. It is not unwanted in the sense that an individual didn't want that particular person to interact with them sexually. That sense of unwanted sexual attention is to mistake the individual bad with the cultural norm. To mistake the merely aesthetic cultural consideration as if it were applicable to the individual as an ethically obligatory kind of concern. Folks in the current can get a sense of this recent historical reality, catcalling as an ethical cultural norm that is, simply by noting that it is highly sought after by women online. The venue has shifted, but the desire to be seen and heard, to have eyes upon her, and to be complimented in this or that way remains. Folks may or may not attempt to make a meaningful ethical differentiation between online and in real-life interactions. I'd here merely note that there was no online interactions in the before times, yet there was the desire to be sexual, sexualized, and in short, catcalled upon nonetheless. The etiquette for doing so differed, and the venue can matter. See the aforementioned point regarding workplace v. non-workplace kinds of concerns, but the ethicity of it was all merely aesthetical, and so too it remains. This is not to suggest that sexual harassment isn't a thing. The cultural norm, which has always been in place for what it's worth, is that if the person receiving the sexual attention says no, then you stop. This can get into murky territory in regards to courtship and wooing someone, as in the cultural practice of respectfully trying multiple times with the same person, even though they have turned you down before. Again, it is worth noting that such has always been a practice, a kind of culturally agreed norm of behavior between the sexes. One in which women especially have utilized as a methodology of interaction, playing it up, to obtain this or that. Flirting, wooing, and so forth. The thing about this is, there is no single solution to the problem. Wooing, courtship, etc. take on differing cultural norms. We can all agree if someone says no, you generally stop. Yet funnily enough, we can likely also all agree that there are respectful ways to try again, and that generally folks appreciate exactly that kind of romancing. Sexual harassment, and in general, sexism as a collective action problem literally amounts to agreed to cultural norms of behavior in our songs and dances. It is problematized insofar as there are differences therein. The problems are relativized to cultural norms, and not by and large at any rate, related to anything else. Such amounts to a kind of aesthetic harm, something that is praise/blameworthy, but is not something that is of obligatory ethical import. See The Odd Questions of Privilege, A Slight History of Colonialism. Understanding that there will be bad actors therein, and to actively police for them in some manner or another. As a collective action problem in a post-effective birth control reality, and within a broadly multicultural context, it becomes more difficult to get agreement. After all, in pre-effective birth control times, the problem really was how to get these humans married off as quick as possible so that their lives can be reasonably lived given the reality they are going to fuck and have babies in short order. In the current, however, the songs and dances can continue indefinitely. Folks have the liberty to be sexual without necessarily facing immediate consequences in the form of becoming responsible for raising a baby. Likewise, whereas in a monocultural context, the collective action problem doesn't really have to deal with the reality that differing peoples will have differing norms of behavior, each of which are technically ethically praiseworthy. and each will have differing opinions of bads of behavior that amount to ethically blameworthiness. To be clear, there will be some view that is ethically praiseworthy within one culture, that is perhaps ethically blameworthy in another culture, and yet neither view obtains anything of serious concern, e.g. neither are speaking of anything that is ethically obligatory, or worth much more than a snide remark or an appraising gaze. This isn't to suggest, again, that there are no instances of intersexual interaction that obtain a concern of an ethical obligatory kind. It is to say, bluntly, that there is a lot of bullshit in the currents that are characterizable as gross categorical errors and collection action problems and problems of the commons. Partly this piece is to be handling these kinds of issues. One aspect of that as a collective action problem is the agreement to use effective birth control and to practice safer sex practices towards the mitigation/elimination of STIs. Another aspect of sexism as a collective action problem is the cultural agreements required for indefinite songs and dances. Understanding that agreements therein amount to mutually created cultures between the participants, not some one-sided demand. The disposition of forcing the issue as a demand by any party involved is exactly what creates the collective action problem. In real terms, very likely folks ought to understand such as struggling to get lovers. There is, in other words, great value in getting a long-term lover, and some value in getting a short-term lover. Speaking sexually, and in terms of love, and in terms of the pragmatics of life, that is, what else we gonna do? Recognizing that as such is step one in solving the collective action problem. Folks ought and perhaps have to recognize that women and men want to fuck. That sex is a good, not unqualified, but that it is a good in life. This is step 2, and it's important because of the feminine demure, the power of vulnerability, the power of the receiver, which pretends to not like, want, and enjoy it is a major stumbling block in reaching any kind of agreement. The feminine demure is a modality of sexual interaction that is heavily critiqued in this series. See especially the section, Iterative Gendered Sexual Violence. Such can fruitfully be understood as the disposition of pretense as a means of manipulation to get what someone wants. While it is characterized and gendered as a feminine kind of behavior, folks ought not conclude that therefore it is a behavior that only women do. In the common discourse, folks may also grasp at the notion as women's tears, that is, the capacity of women in particular to cry foul, and thereby direct blame and consequences towards someone else, whereby the menses go, do the things to deal with the problems they've expressed. Such of course could be valid, that is, it could be the case that the tears were warranted, the harms real, etc. But the point here is that they definitely needn't be, and oft enough are not. Although not strongly argued for in this section, the feminine demure is noted and argued for in The Rape of the Swan series as being a foundational aspect of the gross categorical errors of such things as racism, but also such things as sexism. In other words, the pretense of harm with the misdirection of blame towards such gross categorizations predicated upon sex, race, class, gender, etc. Note that these important aspects amount to nothing more than head nodding, yet they are critically important aspects in handling a collective action problem. They may seem trite, obvious, or they may not. But the thing with the collective action problem is that it is obvious and oft folks can see it from the perspective of the self-per-s. There is an important sense that the details of the song and dance don't matter nearly as much as folks think they may, but that having no song and dance, no cultural understanding is very likely untenable. Consider the notion of giving flowers in literal exchange for sex. Is there any reason why such has to be that way? No. But there is no reason why things can't be that way either. That is, there are no obvious or unobvious reasons as to why ethically or practically speaking such ought or ought not be the norm. The flower gift within a cultural context in which it is understood that to accept the flowers entails the accepting of sexuality already includes the right of refusal. The flowers are a symbolic and literal means of asking with some degree of delicacy beyond, "You wanna fuck?" We may ponder why not just be direct and ask, "You wanna fuck?" But then I think such largely ignores any emotive sense of the people involved, and potentially reduces human interaction to a series of statements predicated upon little more than first impressions. We may, for instance, note the various horrors in the online dating scene as indicative of exactly that kind of disposition. For sure, once a sexual relationship has begun, or after some sense of wooing has occurred, the direct question, "You wanna fuck?" has significant value. But the modality of such as a measure of wooing beyond its shallowness has meaningful consequences in terms of how such plays out upon iteration. Leaving aside the point of the sexual violence such iterative actions cause, addressed elsewhere in this series, that kind of directiveness creates the beauty problem, which one ought expect within a collective action problem. Specifically, first impressions are predicated upon presentation, beauty in a word. Hence, the decision-making process gears itself towards whomever so happens to be considered beautiful within a given cultural context. In brief, the analysis holds that women go for top-tier men, and men for top-tier women, each judging the other sex predicated upon their looks, and various culturally defined qualities indicative of status within the society. While the vast majority of folks of either sex end up with no or little prospects. This is exactly the problem of beauty, as it relates to sexism as a collective action problem. Relevantly therein is the disposition of especially but not exclusively women to exactly not pick lovers outside of their preconceived notions of beauty. The reason why there is an onus on women in this instance is that to some meaningful extent men are less picky, in terms at least of who they may find sexually desirable. This matters particularly much in a reality of indefinite songs and dances. When the choice is towards finding a one and only for lifelong sex, love, family building, etc., this kind of pickiness makes some far greater degree of sense. When the choice is towards finding a brief lover, a one-night stand, an indefinite lover, in a context whereby multiple lovers are understood to be the plausible outcome in one's life, that degree of pickiness is simply out of place. Worse than that, such pickiness causes rather extensive practical problems upon iterative action. Such pickiness is likely also predicated upon the cultural norms wherein men initiate and women receive, the notion that women, in other words, have a luxury of choice. That luxury of choice, however, is largely illusory in practice. There are, after all, always other women that the man, more broadly, the initiator can approach. There may also be biological elements involved, specifically hormones associated with sexuality that differ between men and women, by which the temperament of sexuality is likewise thereby differed. In this latter case though, we ought to note that such differences are not a bad, they are the way the species is. To be utterly antagonistic to the point, boys will be boys and girls will be girls. Such pickiness likewise is plausibly related to womb guarding, the concern that is of pregnancy. The only oddity therein being that men also womb guard in general. The major difference being that in theory a POS man can just walk away, but of course in practice such is not generally the case, and that pregnancy entails actual risk to the welfare of the woman, as in, it changes their body, and risks actual long-term health effects and death. Importantly note though that this particular concern, womb guarding, is out of place in the currents wherein modern effective birth control is a reality. It is a kind of behavior that is as odd as, for instance, trying to bail out water when there is no water present, or to do so without a bucket. It is completely absurd behavior, out of context or placement to the reality that it is occurring. Here I am going to digress a bit to focus on this supposed point, as I think it is a good way for folks to grasp at the issues associated with the feminine demure, and how such kinds of actions functionally create the issues of gross categorical error being analyzed in this section. It is critically important to note how vanishingly small the risk of death via maternity really is. The percentage varies by country and somewhat by race, poverty status, etc., but in all cases the percentage is less than 0.05%. The highest rate in the past 25 years was 0.0173%, and the lowest rate was 0.00002%. In other words, this is not a meaningful life and death concern. People take greater risks than this all the time in their lives. This point is somewhat disturbingly pertinent to bring up, as it highlights the aspect of the feminine demure previously alluded. In even the worst of cases, and let's be clear, the worst of cases cited is one wherein poverty, war, and rape are norms, the death rate from giving birth is so low as to be laughable as a concern. Moreover, the differences between the worst and the best cases of these are vanishingly small. That is, there are orders of magnitudes of differences involved, but those orders of magnitude of differences in absolute terms are actually quite tiny. The difference between 0.00002% and 0.0173% is several orders of magnitude, which sounds super impressive, but in either case the actual health risk is small, and in absolute numbers we are speaking of differences that amount to dozens of people per 100,000. Such isn't to suggest we ought not do something about it, or that there is literally nothing of concern there. Good quality healthcare is important, and such does in point of fact save lives. All that is true and important, but how big of a concern is it really? That is, how many tears do we need to shed over it? How upset and emotionally charged with anger ought we to actually be about it? Again and again, not to say, therefore don't do anything about it, but rather to ask soberly, how serious is the issue? Is there a real gendered horror show happening there? Are cultures actually treating women like breeding machines and dumping them? Is giving birth actually unsafe? To what, if anything, does the issue point? Is there really a gendered problem there? Are there real racial differences therein worth serious consideration? To what gross category of thought ought we consider those differences? Are those differences actually worthwhile to consider at all? The stats on it are far less convincing of this as being a problem than the numbers of worst and best cases too. Those exaggerate the problem rather dramatically, insofar as it is a problem. Most countries, and hence the overwhelming majority of people, perhaps on the order of 99.9999% of people, have a maternal mortality rate that is akin to 0.005% or less rather than either of the extremes previously cited. That is to say, giving birth is an extremely safe activity, specifically, statistically, it is 99.995% safe, or better. Yet it is a massive talking point in the politics and the social discourses. Moreover, differences between rich, poor, and by race, are all cited as being relevant because there are orders of magnitude of differences that occur. Which is true. But again, in terms of absolute values, we are actually talking about tiny differences, and differences which are so small that they may very well be statistical errors, anomalies or artifacts of the data, and their attribution to these gross categories of distinction are dubious, to put it very kindly. To be blunt, and less kind, it sounds a lot more like lies, manipulation, and bullshitting than anything else, which is to say, sounds like the feminine demure. For example, American black women may correctly note that there are orders of magnitude of differences between the maternal mortality rates of black women v. white women, and therefore make the claim that there is massive systemic racism within the system. Yet, such disparities are so tiny that we are talking about literally a few people per 100,000 in difference, which could be attributable to, for instance, the systemic poverty that black folks face in America, which does stem from systemic racism. Just so we're clear on that point, statistical errors, anomalies, or artifacts of the data, or gasp, maybe there is some kind of biological or lifestyle difference. On that last point, if there is, critically note how tiny that difference really is, e.g., wow, what an amazing difference between the biology or lifestyle that really makes winky face. Regardless, the differences are so small as to not be meaningfully appreciable as a concern, compared to, for instance, the issues of systemic poverty American black women face, and pertinently to the pointed questions of this section, piece, and series. Such is an example of how the feminine demure demarcates predicated upon gross categories of distinction that are not necessarily applicable to the situation, hence, creating the collective action problem. Noting there is nothing special about black women in that regard, white women's tears are infamously a thing. I choose to highlight an example of black women doing the thing so as to try and properly and more broadly denote such as a feminine thing, a gendered thing, rather than as a racial thing. Again, the menses do this sort of thing too. The claim here though is that the womenses disproportionately do it, and indeed, that the reason it is a feminine gendered kind of behavior has to do with the cultural disposition of women to be the receivers rather than the initiators in gendered cultural sexual interactions. The explicit argument for this being made a bit later in this series. Here folks also ought note how this concern regarding mortality rates due to pregnancy relates to the problems associated with power grabbing. It is a major political talking point, despite it being of nominal actual threat. Its highly politicized nature comes to affect the actual lives of people, women and men, in their day-to-day, year-to-year living. In that it creates fear at the prospects of pregnancy and discord within the familial relations, rather strikingly out of proportion to the actual threat and relevance of the issue involved. Returning from the digression and bringing it back to the point, these kinds of feminine demurred concerns are aesthetical in their form. A kind of pickiness in terms of selecting mates, lovers, etc. The broad solution within the dating, hookup, and casual sexuality aspects therefore may come down to a rather simple point: be willing to try dating outside of your aesthetic standards. Rather than the current feminist disposition to create a beauty aesthetic in which all bodies are beautiful by publicly celebrating beauty beyond a given cultural norm, the practice of creating the reality of a beauty aesthetic that is inclusive to a variety of beauty norms is exactly through the actions of dating, being sexual with, and forming relationships with folks whom do not necessarily meet your immediate sense of beauty. In my personal experience, in looking at the data, in going by stereotypes, in listening to complaints and critiques regarding men via the feminisms, in going through the logic of relationship as initiator and receiver, in analyzing the emotive realities of relationships, is talking to and listening to women, everything strongly suggests that the problem largely rests with women's inability to do this. Broadly understanding such as the problems of the unrestrained sub. The sub, the receiver, the feminine demure, which actively tries to utilize their sexuality as a means of control, manipulation, and in some, power grabbing. For sure there is a masculine element to the problem, specifically the issues regarding domination. The unrestrained dom. Many of these issues have been well noted within the feminist literature, and so I don't particularly want to repeat them here. Of the issues noted in the feminist lit, I will focus on the reality of slut-shaming in regards to men doing so towards women, and the disposition of a masculine-derived beauty aesthetic of women, as it has specific relevance to this analysis. Slut-shaming, as I am understanding it, is a derivative of the masculine fear that a woman may become pregnant with another man's child. As with so many other aspects of the species' songs and dances, something that makes a lot of sense in a pre-affective birth control reality, but which is out of place in a post-affective birth control reality. Such touches upon the myriad of men's reproductive rights issues, which are TBH perhaps of greater concern in the current than women's reproductive rights issues. But the focus herein is that such is a concern regarding familial form and not necessarily dating, hookup culture, etc. In terms of the behaviors of men towards women in this regard, what the difficulty seems to be is the difference between finding that one and only, and that of the process whereby one does in fact find that one and only. We can, and perhaps ought, to note that in a post-affective birth control reality, the notion of the one and only as such, that is monogamy, has far less import in terms of long-term quality of life than polyamory. In other words, sexuality, love's relations, etc., beyond finding one's primary lover, lifelong mate, etc., no longer entail anything like a necessary commitment to not be sexual with others, or become in love with others, and so forth. I want to bring to the fore the point a bit better. Monogamy as it is traditionally understood is one and only one lover throughout one's life. If you do not practice this, then you are not traditionally monogamous, you are traditionally polyamorous. Folks really ought to grasp at that point, if you have had sex with more than one person in your life, you are by traditional standards of monogamy, polyamorous. This is true even if you were aiming towards being monogamous, e.g. sure, I slept around prior to getting married, in order to exactly find the one and only. Nonetheless, that is actually polyamorous by basically all traditional standards. The reasons why ought to be obvious, but they have a great deal to do with especially birth control. Prior to modern effective birth control, being monogamous was exactly birth control. It defined safe sex practices more or less. Post-modern effective birth control, the concerns associated with birth control as manifested via monogamous dispositions, and various concerns about sluttiness, be that about men or women, radically shifted. Monogamy as a concept shifted towards concerns regarding long-term child-rearing and long-term emotionally committed relationships, rather than sexuality as such. In other words, there are valid concerns regarding the having and raising of children, that they be raised in committed loving relationships, and there are concerns about being emotionally committed to someone for the longer haul, but there aren't concerns regarding sexual fidelity as such. Hence, folks these days hear monogamy and think, I eventually want to get married and settle down, but until then I am going to be sexual with whomever I want. But that is very clearly not what that term meant throughout most of human history, specifically, pre-modern effective birth control. We can still see this point for instance in societies that do not have access to modern effective birth control. Monogamy maintains that kind of traditional meaning. A significant and serious point here is that folks living in any culture whereby that traditional notion of monogamy is not the norm, are in point of fact actually traditional polyamorous folks. The ethics therein are polyamorous ethics. The norms and considerations therein are actually polyamorous norms and considerations, even when folks are being monogamous in the modern sense of that term. Granted that terms change, but this point is fairly critical to note as folks in the current discourses are so profoundly confused as to what these terms mean, that is, that folks regularly call polyamorous folks monogamous, label themselves as monogamous when they are polyamorous, and basically in fight with each other over what flavor of polyamory they are. Very few folks in cultures where modern effective birth control is a reality are monogamous in any sense of what that term has ever meant in any other context in human history. Nonetheless, the disposition towards finding that one and only persists. The notion that the number of folks a woman has been with necessarily entails that they are not marriage material is flatly false. Similar can be said of men, however, such doesn't manifest nearly as much in terms of women's concern towards men on this point, at least that I have noticed. It is there for sure. I've been slut-shamed aplenty. Fuckboy is a term out there in the world after all, as a derogatory. The process of finding a long-term lover in a post-effective birth control reality includes the practice of being sexual beforehand. There is no obvious reason why it shouldn't. Folks that are opposed to such things are inherently anti-modern contraception at all, and it ought be recognized that such entails not only a reversion for women to the duties of the house, but also a reversion of men to the duties of the labors within the community. In sum, it entails a complete ending of anything like a capacity for men and women to perform the full range of aspects life has to offer. The point therein being, imho, slut-shaming as such is a most serious issue in regards to the iterative functional reality the species wants to make. This mistaking of the familial value of a long-term lover as being applicable to the value of a liberated sexuality within the dating scene is archaic and the worst kind of sense. It holds sexuality, love's many bloomings, and relational goods as inherent evils. It mistakes virginity as indicative of sexual fidelity, and it mistakes sexual fidelity as love's fidelity. In terms of the beauty aesthetic by which men throw upon women, beyond the details of body shape therein, the disposition to understand beauty in terms of reproduction capacity and familial exclusion are the primary issues. Hence, the disposition towards younger women, and the disposition towards excluding women who already have children. This kind of delimiting of the form of beauty predicated upon a notion of family which predates affective birth control has little place in the currents of reality post-affective birth control. Understanding that pre-affective birth control, such metrics likely made sense in terms of pragmatics and affective forms of concern. Such metrics do not make sense in terms of the aesthetics of value wherein loves and sexualities are no longer required to adhere strictly to the limits of the biological reality that to have sex virtually entails the procreation of children, and the procreation of children entails the lifelong obligation. While there does remain a biological reality that insofar as a man is looking to have children, and less so but relevantly, insofar as a woman is looking to have children, age does matter. Procreation is not possible for women beyond menopause, and men are less likely to procreate in their older age. Hence, there does remain some sense of concern in particular for men, less so for women, in regards to age and long-term relationships. That said, women are generally capable of procreating well into their 40s, and there are techniques available to extend that age. More importantly, in terms of considerations of beauty, desirability, and so forth, there is significant value to be had with a more mature woman. They tend to have their lives together more, they tend to have careers of value, and so forth. Similarly, viewing women who already have children as inherently a bad quality ignores the obvious plausibility that one thereby has an actual test case as to if they are in fact a good mother. Likewise for women and their concerns for a good father. Crudely, but relevantly, a woman or man that has actual sexual experience is valuable in the sense that they know what they are doing in the sack. As a collective action problem, sluttiness and slut-shaming both present aspects of issues. Sluttiness, as previously noted, entails the plausibility that the songs and dances may go on for a rather extended period of time, perhaps even indefinitely long. This is distinctly different in a pre-modern birth control reality. This creates unique kinds of issues, for this species at any rate. A fairly fundamentally new sort of dating, loves relations issues, but not merely issues, also goods, beauties, modalities of life, love, living, etc. There are many a good that stem from this sort of thing, which ought not be lost or forgotten by pointing out some of the issues. Some of the issues as being new for that matter, in the hopes of addressing exactly those issues. Slut-shaming as a problem presents itself rather horrifically within the current reality wherein the songs and dances, wherein love's beauties may flourish, wherein the many bloomings of love's becoming and being are a kind of lived experiential reality, Something like slut-shaming takes on a dastardly form of hatred against life and love. On the one hand, it is a kind of anachronistic ethical analysis, that is, it places the plausibly ethically sound concerns of the slut historically and misapplies them wherein those pragmatic ethical concerns are no longer valid. They may, however, remain emotionally valid, but then, one ought seriously consider the origins, purposes, and consequences of those kinds of emotions, jealousy, insecurities, rivalry, pride, etc. If we are to hold that modern effective birth control is a good, if we are to hold that sexuality is a good, if we are to hold that love's relations and relatas are a good, each perhaps not unqualifiably so, but a good nonetheless, then we cannot also hold that those kinds of emotions are of particular ethical import. That perhaps, those are the sorts of emotive states that we ought to seriously ameliorate. As a collective action problem, slut-shaming and sluttiness are in tension with each other as a matter of what constitutes cultural consent of sexual interactions. Modalities of approach, when, why and how to accept an approach, consequences of sexuality, etc. Without too much ado given to the matter, I want to suggest that the major limiting factors involved are temporal in form. Specifically, long-term relationships are a valuable sort of thing, and even if we assume a particularly slutty kind of life, the sheer amount of time left available to devote to someone becomes limited. This isn't to suggest at all that the reactionary and fairly anachronistic ethical position of monogamy has any kind of ethical force to it. It is to suggest that there are of course natural sorts of limits on time spent with people as they regard developing meaningful, loving, long-term relationships. Moreover, it is also to strongly suggest that commitment, a willingness to see a relationship through, to be devoted to exactly those long-term relationships, are all strikingly important sorts of things in life, loves, and sexuality. Slut-shaming, we may say, has a kind of placement within that. Namely, whereby sluttiness grows to destroy the capacity of people to maintain their long-term intimate relationships, that kind of ethical cultural disposition actually still has some import to it. However, its overuse is a serious ethical bad, especially within the currents of society, post-effective birth control, whereby sluttiness as an ethical good, again, entails the plausibility of love's many bloomings. To be clear, the blaming of sluttiness upon a gender or sex as a dispositional problem is a collective action problem. To not do that is the solution. It is a problem because it lacks ethical import of an obligatory sense, at any rate, for the most part. Again, the limit therein being temporal in form, the capacity to spend enough time with someone to actually develop meaningful long-term familial forms and long-term emotionally committed relationships.
Below on earth, it is now the eve of the longest day.
Very well. Release the Krakan.
Such is not the concern or belief that folks grow less able to form emotional bonds when they bond emotionally with more than one person. That view is obviously false. People can love more than one person, such as their children, their friends, their family, and folks can in fact love more than one lover, happens all the time. It is rather strictly the point that emotional commitment requires time, and long-term relationships require some degree of devotion. Strictly in terms of sexuality, long-term relationships require a fair amount of mutual sexual servitude, that is, doing the things one's lovers wants to do, being devoted to them sexually speaking, keeping it going, etc. There is a second aspect of the sluttiness and slut-shaming as a collective action problem, namely, that individual instances of being slutty entail a good, but not when viewed by someone not participating in the action. Everyone's having a good time except me. In the current colloquial usage, we are speaking of the incels, men and women. Moreover, we are speaking of them in a sympathetic manner, as products of the collective action problem being described here. As previously alluded to, pickiness is something of a serious issue within an ethically slutty society. We hear this pretty much on all fronts at this point. Beyond the incels, there are the concerns regarding unrealistic beauty standards for women and men, top-tier pickiness, odd sorts of social concerns, racialized beauty standards, odd bits of culturalized beauty standards, that as if it were a one and only choice, and so forth. In each of these instances, for each individual, the prospect to make the choice of who to fuck seems to entail a major sort of decision. Consequently, the decision is made as if towards some specific and singular aim, even when in point of fact the aim is expressly for some short period of time. A one-off, a fuck and run, etc. Or, less derogatorily put, whereby a relationship with multiple lovers can entail a fairly vast swath and scope of aspects, really only limited via the temporal structures within which they are predicated. Here though, the issue really is one of collective action and problems of the commons. Collective action in that individually it makes sense for each person to aim towards some perceived good, the better lover, the top tier, and so forth, yet in practice, that amounts to a serious problem for everyone involved. Definitionally, even at, maximal slutitude of the individuals involved, the top tier cannot realistically provide for the emotional needs, let alone the sexual needs, of everyone that approaches them. In that sense it is also a problem of the commons, whereby we are understanding the sexual interaction of the top tier as the commons, upon which everyone attempts to partake in. This problem becomes apparent and relevantly emerges within the initiator/receiver complex of gender dynamics. From one perspective, that of the receiver, there is a plethora of people catcalling them online, and let's be honest, they of course tend to adore this attention. It is not a terrible thing for them, generally speaking at any rate. They simply cannot keep up with all the attention. Meanwhile, there are receivers who are largely neglected for a variety of reasons. Everyone aiming for the top tier, missing out on all the rest, and all the rest missing out on anything at all. Again, from the initiator's perspective, there is actually a wide plethora of people to choose from. It isn't exactly as the receivers may perceive it. The initiators have plenty of options. The initiators may make the mistake of saying that they'll focus on the top-tier receivers, which makes sense for them individually. Alas, so too does it make sense for everyone else as they consider things in isolation. As a whole, everyone approaching these relatively few individuals entails that very few people actually get what they are aiming for. The receivers may feel like they have the option. After all, look at all those catcallers. However, it isn't as if they were the one and only that was catcalled to. They may mistake it that they can simply choose from among the many. Alas, turns out that is true for all the other receivers whom have received all the catcallers. In either case, for either party involved, indeed, for any party involved. The solutions to these kinds of problems amounts to the following: be daring. Don't merely pick for pickiness. Try out. If one is a receiver, become the initiator. If one is the initiator, become the receiver. But also, recognize that each choice is not a one and only kind of decision, even if one is seeking after one's long-term lover. Ultimately, the solution here is to recognize the collective action problem for what it is, and to not keep doing the same sort of behavior. These issues bleed into the issues of the problem of the commons. The astute and perhaps irate reader may at this point note, not wrongly, that I haven't presented a specific norm of behavior for sexual interactions, for these indefinite songs and dances of love's many bloomings. Tisk tisk, such a hyper-moralized needy kind of reader ye are. As a problem of the commons, sexual interactions are a bit less clear. Such amounts to the problems of sharing and time restrictions within relationships. For sexual and love's interactions, the problem of the commons are largely emotive problems, very likely emotive problems associated with the realities of pre-affective birth control. In sum, these amount to problems of sharing. Therein, I want to be super clear that such is not some evil patriarchal overlords, nor for that matter, evil matriarchal overlords. The issues therein are deeply emotive in form, surround the realities of sexually procreating children, and the realities involved in raising those children. Jealousy, hatred, fear of being left alone, fear of being abandoned, and so forth. These are all very likely rooted within that pre-affective birth control reality. Similarly, though I won't deal with it directly in this section, concerns regarding abortion are almost certainly rooted therein as well. It is unclear to what extent these kinds of emotions are biologically embedded within the species, and to what extent they are malleable via the culture. But folks, especially the very conservative peoples and the radical feministas, ought seriously consider the degree by which these kinds of emotions create the very horrors we face in our lives, and how far are these sorts of folks operating in undue influence by these emotive concerns. Not only in terms of the day-to-day lives of people who are just like raising a family and having a loving relationship, wherein fights often center around exactly these kinds of concerns, but also all the BS within the culture regarding gendered norms, conservative familial forms, and various dating dramarama. Note the absolute cowardliness involved in the face of loves that such dispositions actually entails. There is a very meaningful sense in which folks' inability to face such things structures our cultures in profoundly negative ways. As a matter of broad cultural outputs, that kind of emotive thinking entails the construction of borders of exclusion. On a socio-cultural level, there is every indication that such modalities of thought inform the rationale for the creation of political borders. Racism, classism, and sexism. Doesn't matter much from which perspective one is talking about either. Masculine, feminine, queer, nationalistic, etc. All these kinds of borders are created and driven by this modality of emotional thinking that is a derivative of the biological realities of sexuality and love's relations dating from pre-affective birth control times. As I said, it remains unclear if those emotive aspects of the species are indelibly embedded within the biology, or if they have far more been trained within the species via countless millennia of living a cultural reality predicated upon exactly these kinds of valid concerns regarding propagation of the species. Regardless of that, the questions of love's relations as a matter of dealing with cultural problems very likely entails exactly dealing with those emotive issues. To the extent whereby these emotional issues stem from the socio-cultural practices alluded to in the pre-effective birth control times, such entails something that will tend to go away on its own. However, helping it along the way may be a very pertinent sort of thing to do. The point therein being something like the following: the belief that sexuality with someone else entails pregnancy, also comes to entail concerns of the welfare of the familial form, all current relationships, etc. Again, the conflation of sexual fidelity with that of love's fidelities, all over valid concerns regarding fidelity of lineage and the welfare of the familial form. These kinds of concerns also manifest themselves in a valid manner whereby people fail to respect the familial form, or the longer-term relationship form. That is, when folks hold to themselves as themselves, the self per se, the individualist, the relationship anarchist. To be clear, it isn't necessarily that such individualists are out of place as such, it is that they are out of place within longer-term relationships. Their individualist attitudes will tend towards the erosion and disrespecting of the longer-term relationship, much to the detriment of even the individualist. The individualist too mistakes love's fidelities as sexual fidelity and both as incursions upon their freedom of form. That is, they hold that love's fidelities entail sexual fidelity, that if there is a lacking of sexual fidelity then there is also a lacking in love's fidelities, and that for either sort of fidelity that such imposes some kind of restriction upon their otherwise freedom of formal expression. All of these are false. Freedom of formal expression includes, and indeed entails, freedom of expression via other people. Here the individualist mistakes themselves per se as being the medium of formal expressions of freedom, rather than themselves per vox. They hold that an action is free in its formal structure provided that it is of their own and specifically not through another. Hence, the individualists tend towards a kind of gross infighting over things, a battling of wills to try and get their way. Pervos freedom of expression is functionally free via exactly the working through another. Freedom of formal expression with another entails a greater formal expression of freedom, simply in virtue of being through another. Blandly put, and at least somewhat missing the point, what people can do together is different and in some sense greater than what they can do alone. The individualist is in that sense missing out on the freedom of formal expression by effectively cutting out whole swaths of freedom of expression by exactly thinking and acting as if freedom of expression entails individualism in form. It is a bit crude but actually more apt to note this in terms of sexuality. What a lover of themselves can do sexually with themselves is limited to themselves. Masturbation, with or without the assistance of someone else. To go to, for instance, the meat market, the club, or a prostitute to get one's sexual jollies off, a plausibly perfectly fine sort of thing to do, entails a certain kind of limitation to the formal expression of sexual freedoms thereof. It is masturbatory in its structure, regardless of if there are others involved. Each masturbates with the other as a prop to themselves. Within a sexual relationship of a longer-term structure, the same kind of thing obtains for the individualist. There is some things they themselves want, and their view of the situation is rather much like a battle to get that thing from their lover. Sexuality expressed in this or that specific manner, rather than a sexuality that is derivative of the other in a mutual manner. Hence, the perverse modality of sexuality and loves entailing a sort of mutual subservience towards the other, whereby one sexuality is a derivative of the other, though not utterly subsumed by it either. The mutuality of the sexuality entails the non-subsuming. There is thereby more available to the people involved, simply in virtue of being willing to do the things the other wants to do. Such amounts to a kind of daringness in loves, that the individualist is oft too cowardly to do. Likewise, for non-couplings, for that is, more than couplings, triads, threesomes, quads, and foursomes, the sheer possibilities themselves already present a far wider swath of options available than are via the coupling or the individual as such. However, much as the coupling can be merely masturbatory in its formal structure, so too these kinds of structures can also be merely masturbatory in their form, despite all the peoples involved. What one does with that, in other words, for the individualist is essentially utilize it to get themselves off. Their actions are fundamentally limited by the scope of their personhood as being merely individualistic in its formal structure. To them, to say no to something is almost a penultimate form of expression of personal freedom. It is to exercise their personal will upon another through the formal structure of delimiting the modality of expression. It's fairly absurd, in other words, that folks would take such as a freedom of expression, rather than a freedom to regress. A delimiting of the structural form, to the whim of the individual. Or, conversely, to force the issue, without regard to the others involved, to manipulate, contrive, or control the points of order in such a way that what happens is all and only exactly what the individualist wants to happen. In either case, the end result is a lesser form of freedom in sexual expression. The greater formal modality is to take into heart the perverse modality of mutual sexual service. To hold that the aim is exactly to pleasure the others, that they too exactly ought aim to pleasure the others, and to them do the things thereby to pleasure each other. Such presents a far greater range of possibilities for folks in terms of raw actions that can be taken, not merely in terms of the increase in the number of participants, but in the exponential increase in the possibilities of desires predicated upon the other people's desires rather than the mereness of the individualist's per se mentality. See also, compatibility in an age of plenty, and iterative gendered sexual violence. Time. Each of us only has so much time to go around. This aspect is far less emotive in origin, as it is emotive in response to that sort of reality. The notion of long-term relationships and the reality of creating and raising children well both entail a serious time commitment that is not unreasonable. As slutty, as open, as poly as we may want to be, these things run smack up against the limits of individualistic concerns. When a relationship fails to acknowledge these kinds of commitments, when the individuals involved in long-term love relations understand themselves as merely their self, the self per se, the relationship becomes nothing but competitive, the familial form degenerates, any children therein suffer, and indeed the individuals therein suffer. Such is taking the plausibly ethically valid disposition of concern for the self in the dating world and misapplying it to the ethical concerns of familial and long-term relations. It is trite, misleading, destructive, and unethical to hold within any long-term relationship that the individuals ought merely concern themselves with their self. There are only a few valid solutions to this kind of issue as regards sexual and love's relations. One is the insular long-term relationship. The nuclear family, a very modern-styled relationship, wherein there is some kind of significant division between the sexes in terms of even who they are allowed to hang out with. This kind of familial form holds its loves and sexualities as the exclusive province of the coupling therein. While this is a valid ethical solution in the sense that such protects everyone involved from experiencing the emotive distresses mentioned above, such is also the primary cause for concern regarding our broad-scale cultural outputs. This kind of familial form also tends to lose larger-scale community bonds, as folks tend towards a strict reliance upon each other within the relationship, rather than within the community. I want to differentiate that from being codependent, as the latter is more a serious psychological disorder, if it is anything meaningful at all. The former is merely noting the bland reality of monogamous relationships as they relate towards the community as a whole. The intergenerational familial form eschews some of the exclusivity of the nuclear familial form. Love's relations, though not sexuality relations, are broadened to the extended family. Such generally enables the inclusion of the community in the form of extended familial friends relations, creating a kind of community bonding structure that the nuclear family has an extremely difficult time replicating. The polyamorous familial form holds itself as primary and central, be that a coupling, a triad, etc., likely to some meaningful time-constrained limit. I suspect realistically that limit broadly is about 4 or 5 people within a polycule. The limits therein again having far more to do with the realities of plausibility of quality time spent together. The rationale for that particular number, beyond personal experience, has to do with the notion of two primary couples dating each other as being a very realistic and potentially stable formulation, with the plausible addition of one more as a floater creating various triad relations, the triad relation also being a known stable polyam form. Note that this is discussing polyam as a familial form, rather than a loose hyper-individualistic form. The complexity of the relationships involved grow exponentially if one takes the emotive concerns mentioned above dreadfully seriously. Notably therein, the pragmatics involved in regards to sexual and loving obligation remain. In other words, the various obligations involved in fulfilling the needs, wants and desires of one's various lovers. The general framework for the polyam familial form largely entails the doing of activities together. Which isn't to say such activities cannot be done separately, it is rather to hold that the predominance of interactions with others, sexual, loving, or otherwise, ought be done together. The principal reason therein being that the familial form requires something very much like that. In terms of the individuals involved, the long-term relationship itself ought be understood as a general good, the aim in such things. In terms of any children involved, it has to be understood that for the children the stability of the home is critically important. There is, in short, an obligatory ethical imperative to not do things that would destroy or degrade the polyam familial form. Note that this does not entail the inability of the polyam-familial form to maintain itself. Folks frequently seem to confuse the possibility of sexuality with others as a perpetual free-for-all. Again, such is to take the open dating form and misapply it to the polyam-familial form. Short of abusive relationships, there is a meaningful obligatory ethical imperative for folks with children to remain within their relationships. Simple dissatisfaction, especially within a polyam relationship wherein that dissatisfaction can be alleviated through the reliance on another for one's sexual and love's needs, wants and desires, is disrespectful to everyone involved and harmful to the children. Mutual dissatisfaction is perhaps more tenable, as all parties involved therein are failing at having their needs, wants and desires met. The notion of this is that relationships get ill from time to time, and part of a long-term relationship is exactly to help each other get through those sorts of times. Hence, the mere dissatisfaction of one party is not a good reason to end the relationship. Indeed, not only is it not a good reason, it is exactly those kinds of situations that the commitment of a long-term relationship is referring to. A committed relationship, in other words, is exactly not this, only so far as I so happen to feel like it. If the dissatisfaction is mutually felt, all parties broadly agreeing that the relationships are terrible and ought to end, then it is at least plausibly the case that they would be better suited to ending the relationship. That is, the committed aspects of the relationship are plausibly incapable of dealing with that situation. Note, somewhat critically, that this is a sort of pragmatic concern. That is, it is unlikely that the long-term relationship's commitments towards each other are to bring about a desirable situation, as neither party is satisfied sufficiently to have the goodwill to help the other. It may be the case that outside intervention could be helpful, and I would caution against thinking that the moment mutual dissatisfaction occurs that everyone cut and run, but the point is that at some well-considered point, mutual dissatisfaction with a relationship is plausibly sufficient grounds for ending a long-term commitment. As to if the suggestion here is that there be a legally binding aspect here, or merely a strong cultural norm, I am inclined towards the latter. While I find the degree whereby people cut and run from long-term relationships in the current to be quite disturbingly disgusting and exceedingly unhealthy for everyone involved, I am old and wise enough to recognize the absolute horrors that arose when marriages in particular were legally binding sorts of arrangements whereby someone had to prove a wrong of some kind in order to obtain a relinquishing of the marriage obligation. I would again direct the curious minds to the relevant distinctions between ethical obligatoriness and mere aesthetical ethicalness, noting that here the aesthetical ethical as a matter of relationship formal structure is actually quite strongly ethically binding, its binding being a matter of emotive structure and pragmatic form, as well as having the capacity for a sense of ethicity at all, that is, a capacity to look towards the future and create a formal ought about it. The ethical obligatoriness being directed towards the goods of the relationships, and the children thereof, rather than the aesthetical form that relationship so happens to take. Whereby that aesthetical form is itself a good especially for its capacity of commitment in love towards others, a modality of avoiding the pitfalls of the self per se, the self-perverse capacities of bloomings in loves. Good though it may be, and it may be a great good, nonetheless it is merely aesthetical in its form, and hence lacks obligatoriness in its formal ethical structure. Folks would do well to consider how a long-term relationship, sexual, friendship or familial, can change its formal aesthetic nature and yet maintain the relationship status. The aesthetic therein being the modality whereby the individuals involved are actively interacting with each other. Likewise, and specifically in terms of sexual relationships, the adaptation of the sexual boundaries, as in, who's involved, who isn't, etc. Yet the core ethical structure of commitment and obligatoriness remains to the relationship. There is, in other words, something there of obligatory stature that transcends the mere aesthetical nature of the relationship's form. We can denote such in fairly religious terms regarding the sacredness of matrimony, the notion that our loves do not belong to us, or at least not to us alone. But we can also denote such in the minimized framing here as pragmatics, the importance of emotional fulfillment, the importance of commitment to another, certain pragmatics of following through with one's lovers through thick and thin, rather than cutting and running, and the delineation between the self per se and the self per vos. The life of the self per se leads to loneliness, lack of fulfillment, and ultimately a lack of creative plausibility. For sure therein there is room for individual expression, the individual life, but it ought to be understood that within a familial form such individuation is inherently restrained. To spell it out a bit, the emotive problem of the commons is the plausible inability of individuals to share their emotive space. Noting the above pragmatic time restraints, and familial long-term love's relations restraints is important, but such doesn't cut to the heart of the problem. Even within those restraints, individuals who think in strictly individualistic manners, the self per se, fail to understand the emotive states of others as such. In essence, they seek to sublimate the emotive being of others beneath them. Folks may understand such as treating others as little more than tools for their own gratification and self-fulfillment. In terms of dealing with the naked emotive well-being of others, such amounts to a few things. The capacity to give to others towards their own fulfillment in a mutual way, in a meaningful sense, to be slutty with each other. See for relevant instance, iterative gendered sexual violence later in this series. The capacity to maintain long-term loving relationships, which in pragmatics may mean as little as holding towards some indefinite future together, with purpose. This contrasts rather sharply with the dating notion wherein there is essentially no sense of ethical obligation towards each other. As a gross categorical error, these are the problems between folks who identify themselves strictly as the self per se, and those who identify themselves as the self per vos. Love's familial relations, and the self-love's relations. In either case, a kind of love story, only as real as the feelings we feel. Assuming that the emotive problems of the commons are not indelibly ingrained within the species, or at any rate, that insofar as they are, they can be meaningfully and significantly mitigated. The solution to those kinds of emotive problems has everything to do with recognizing them as such, that is, as problems with sharing as they relate to emotions. Fundamentally, this amounts to folks acting as pure individuals, rather than as familial units. In the Pali parlance, compersion as a mutual reality. Relevant within the currents of the times, the understanding of men and women as absolute different entities is a similar kind of problem. The gender wars as zombies predicated upon a pre-birth control reality in which segregation of the sexes served many a practical purpose. In a meaningful sense too, a failure
But it
to
never
note
did
that
get
while
back
there
up
are
off the
certainly
ground.
differences between the sexes as
It was a
such,
hard act
that
to
each
follow.
are fundamentally queer,
Second
literally
to none.
composed of female and male genes.
They killed him on the altar of the rising sun. Play Misty for me and that old devil moon. Play Anything Goes and Memphis in June. Play Lonely at the Top and Lonely Are the Brave. Play it for Houdini spinning around in his grave. Play Jelly Roll Morton, play Lucille. Play Deep in a Dream and play Driving Wheel. Play Moonlight Sonata in F sharp. And the key to the highway by the king of the harp. Play Marching Through Georgia in Dunbarton strums. Play Darkness and Death Will Come When It Comes. Play Love Me or Leave Me by the Great Bird Pound. Play the Bloodstained Banner, play Murder Most Foul.
¿Qué dices?